This is the Chat City interviews from 103.2 Preston FM with your host, Huey Parr.
Right now, my first studio guest this morning. It's lovely to welcome into the studio. It's Damian Baron, and Damian is from Harrison
Drury Solicitors.
Yes. You see, I'd asked him, I'd written it down, I can't read my own writing. Live radio. Harrison Drury Solicitors here in Preston. Damien, a very good morning.
Welcome. Good morning
to Preston FM. And we were just talking about these days of social media, etc., and communication and the different lifestyles. I'm sure lots of people would think that the divorce rate in particular is getting higher each year and rocketing out there. But in fact, statistics show us that there has been a reduction. Is that right?
That's right. The general divorce rate has been going down for a few years now. Obviously, the marriage rate is going down. More and more people are living together, so you might expect the divorce rate goes down. But rather interestingly, the one age group in which it's going up significantly is my generation, the 50-somethings, 60-somethings. Yes. It's a strange phenomenon. It's possibly due to the fact that, people 50s, 60s, the kids have flown the nest, as it were, the mortgage is paid off, and it's more doable to actually get divorced. But it's very, very interesting. It's a significant spike in that age range. And
is that something that we've seen just over recent years?
It has been going up for a few years now, but I think it's in especially sharp relief now that the general divorce rate is tapering off a little bit. It is over the past few years now. It's not something, I think, historically, and possibly it's a social thing. The older generations were much less likely to get divorced, and maybe that's to do with social attitudes and social mores. You're married for life, etc. Possibly it's the children of the 60s who maybe had a slightly different take on things are now in their 50s, 60s, and it's an interesting stat.
It certainly is. Also we often hear, don't we, these days, that the nuclear family really no longer exists in the way that it used to do in previous generations.
Yeah.
So if you're divorcing at an older age these days, is it more difficult then to actually go through the procedure of divorce?
No, again, I think there's a slight misconception there also. The actual divorce process itself is relatively pain-free. It's more an administrative process now. There are very few occasions when people actually have to go to court in relation to their actual divorce itself. So the procedure to get divorced, some might say, is in a way too easy. We almost do have divorce on demand now. What obviously can be much more difficult is arguments or discussions around distributing assets, who gets what. That is probably a little bit more the more traumatic side of things, and of course that can be expensive in cases where battle lines are drawn in the sand and expensive lawyers are needed to resolve the issues.
And criteria for divorce, that of course has changed over the years.
Yeah, there are 5 grounds for divorce, but the much more usual grounds for divorce are good old-fashioned adultery, which I'm sure I don't need to go into, and what we call in the vernacular, as it were, unreasonable behaviour, which that probably accounts for the majority of divorce cases. Another common one, which is increasingly used, is 2-year separation and the consent of both parties. So that's usually used in a situation whereby people have drifted apart, they agree to separate, and the advantage of that, if both parties agree, is there doesn't need to be any allegations of any wrongdoing or misbehaviour. The ground is merely that, we've lived apart for 2 years and we both want the divorce, rather the marriage dissolved.
And on that one, so that does still apply, the 2-year rule.
Oh yes,
and that is a very simplistic divorce procedure.
Yeah, and it's far and away the least traumatic. The difficulty with the divorce law that we have at the moment is that, in large measure, it's fault-based. Allegations have to be made about, my husband's had an affair or my husband's behaved in such an unreasonable way, which obviously doesn't really promote a fruitful, constructive discussion when talking, for example, about the kids, money, property, etc. So 2-year separation and mutual consent is far away the easiest, less traumatic, and probably the least expensive way to get divorced. Many people use it.
And I take it that the unreasonable behaviour one can be quite a difficult arena, or a difficult one to prove at times?
Well, not necessarily, really. I'm sure when the law was enacted, which the legislation in this area is 40 years old now, so it was enacted in, perhaps slightly different social times. But what's required to satisfy the judge on a behaviour petition really has been watered down over the years, so that almost anything counts. I mean, I have had someone who came to see me, wanted to divorce a husband on the ground of behaviour, and his principal sin was that he snored, and it drove her mad. Now, that actually went into the petition along with one or two other things.
Is that
and
right?
The judge okayed it, and the couple were divorced.
Wow. Yes.
Yes,
wow.
Absolutely. So
I bet there's many people listening to this programme at the moment going to get the telephone directory.
Thinking, yeah. I mean, again, it's people do tend to think it's a very difficult process to actually get divorced. To be perfectly honest, it's a very, very straightforward process. I'm not advocating that people should necessarily go down that route, but it's not the terrible, problematic thing that people think it is.
Right. And one that we were discussing that might surprise lots of people, because you do tend to think it's people in the news, it's the people who are in show business, etc., are the prenuptial agreements. And this now is being taken out by other people who maybe are not in the news or don't have a lot of money. So what are the grounds for a prenuptial agreement, and what do people usually want to see in that agreement?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, just a tiny bit of background. Prenuptial agreements weren't really valid in English law until relatively recently. In that the courts could always tear up a prenuptial agreement and make a completely different set of, or another distribution in place of that which they'd mentioned in the agreement. There was a big case about 4 years ago in the Supreme Court where, in essence, and it's very complicated, so I'm paraphrasing, but in essence what the court said, that provided certain procedural hurdles were overcome, that the agreement in general terms was not unfair, then the court would uphold prenuptial agreements, but they weren't automatically binding. Now, the Law Commission is due to report a bit later this month, and we don't know what's going to be in the report, but we strongly suspect that one of the recommendations is going to be that prenuptial agreements now will become binding in English law.
Right.
I think they're particularly used in circumstances, for example, second marriages, where significant assets might have been accrued by the husband or the wife, and they want perhaps to ring fence them for their own children from that first marriage. Another example may be where you got a business person who's built up very significant assets in a business and doesn't really want that attacked by their new spouse in the event that things go wrong. And again, as you quite rightly say, Huey, people do think, oh well, prenuptial agreements there for Hollywood stars and for film stars, yes. And but not at all. We are receiving at Harrison Drury significant queries and inquiries generally with regard to prenuptial agreements, and it's stuff that we're doing, prenuptial agreements, stuff that we're doing now very, very regularly, and that's going to grow if the Law Commission report as we expect they will. Right,
and it is nearly always to do with assets, etc. So it's around financial security in a way, looking after yourself.
It is, that's right. I think many people, or some people, view the law as being a little bit unfair. I just cite one example. There's a very famous case heard about 4 or 5 years ago. It was an extremely short marriage. The husband was a wealthy individual. I think he was worth about £20 million or so. He marries a lady. The marriage only actually lasted for 2 years and 3 months. And the wife, in that case, all right, fair enough, a child was born, but the wife in that case was awarded £8 million from the £21 million fortune. Now, I don't offer any observations, but some people may think that's perhaps a little unfair. So a situation such as that would be a case that would scream out for a prenuptial agreement. You can't just have anything in a prenuptial agreement, in that it does have to be in general terms fair. So you couldn't, for example, really have a prenuptial agreement that said that in the event of everything going wrong, you leave the house and walk away with zero. That wouldn't be upheld. So it does have to be in general terms fair, but it's actually giving people the power to regulate their own affairs now, with the benefit of legal advice, but allowing them to regulate their own affairs without having a situation or a solution imposed by a judge which might not actually suit either of the parties.
Right.
So it's just giving people a bit more power to decide their own fates, if you want to put it like that.
Right. How often is mediation used these days, and do courts like to see that maybe mediation has been used before a case should go to court?
Yeah, that is increasingly used. Mediation is one of a wide range of things we call ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution. For example, in legal aid cases, or the few cases that still qualify for legal aid these days.
Yes, I was going to ask.
Yeah, I mean, it is a requirement that the parties attend mediation first to see if matters can actually be resolved without, invoking the jurisdiction of the court and all the expense and time which is involved in doing that. Yeah, mediation is extremely useful, and certainly in family law, which is the area in which I practice, we are encouraged, and quite right too, to adopt a conciliatory and constructive approach rather than sort of, lock horns with your opposition like two stags, as it were. So mediation is used increasingly. One of the difficulties with mediation is that the mediator isn't allowed to offer any advice to the party. So the mediator is there merely to facilitate the conversation between the husband and wife, which is fine. But that can cause problems where, for example, the assets involved are complex, for example, business assets, which the non-owning spouse may have difficulty in getting to grips with, especially where there are a number of companies, intercompany loans, the husband is a director and he's got a complex director's loan account arrangement, all this kind of stuff. So mediation is very, very helpful, but my own opinion is it has its limits.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And what about, certainly years ago, etc., the rights of the child often was overlooked when it came to divorce cases, or the needs of the child.
Yeah.
Has that changed these days?
Yeah, I'm very pleased to say that the legislation, the Principal Act of Parliament that we use when we're doing this area of law, states quite categorically that the first consideration of the court has got to be the welfare of the child, and that's quite often why one spouse may do a little bit better than another when it comes to the division of the assets. Is usually, or quite often, because the house is needed, or a house is needed for the child's welfare, not really for the divorcing mum and dad. So I don't think it's going too far to say that when the court's considering any family law case, the rights of the child are the first consideration of the judge, and any result has got to be very, very child-centred. Right.
That's something that is really good to hear. Yes. And also people often confused in the respect of common law, somebody who's lived with somebody for 5 or 6 years and the relationship then comes to an end.
Yes.
What are the rights of the parties there?
Yeah, that is a very, very difficult area, and one that's causing more and more problems, really, as more and more people elect to live together as opposed to getting married. First of all, there is no such thing as a common law wife or husband, which I'm sure will be a bit of a surprise to quite a few of your listeners.
Yes.
I quite often have people that come in and say, oh, well, I've lived with my partner now for 5 years, and so therefore I'm common law spouse, aren't I? And I'm entitled to half his business and some of his pension, etc. And the answer is, I'm afraid not. No. The law with regard to divorcing couples is very, very different to the law of cohabiting couples. And it is much more difficult for the non-owning spouse really to gain any financial remedy against the other. People often, people who elect to live together quite frequently or buy a property together. That's not particularly problematic because the normal rules of property apply, and if that house is sold, then both are entitled to their share of the sale proceeds. The more difficult situation arises where all of the assets, including a house, are in one person's name. Now, in the event of that relationship breaking down, incredible though it may seem, in very many cases, even after cohabitation of perhaps 10 or 15 years, and perhaps even when there have been children, the non-owning spouse doesn't have any automatic rights in relation to the other's property. Now, again, that's something which the government are looking at, and we are expecting that in years to come they will change the law, because this is something which has got to be addressed. We're getting to a situation now where a significant percentage of the population are in fact living together. So it is a problem area, but whether we will see significant change in the law in that area in the next few years, I'm not entirely sure, because the issues are so very, very complicated.
Yeah, I can understand that. What about these days? So many things are changing, and we've talked about people who live together. What about civil partnerships?
Yeah, the law changed obviously to allow civil partnerships a number of years ago. The law with regard to civil partnerships is almost identical to that relating to divorcing couples. So the fact that it is a same-sex relationship, partnership, doesn't really have any effect at all on how, for example, assets are divided when that partnership breaks down. So the law is absolutely identical.
Right.
My own personal view is that I think that legislation was long overdue.
Right.
And
yes.
Obviously it does assist a very significant section of society now in same-sex relationships, so they are no longer, in effect, discriminated against should that relationship break down.
So they could also look for some kind of prenuptial agreement before
Absolutely
the civil
right.
partnership.
Absolutely right. I did one again, probably a same-sex relationship, probably no more than 3-4 months ago.
Right.
So the rules are entirely and exactly the same.
So I'm sure over the years there must have been many reasons given, and many people come to you seeking divorce with various stories. Is it, have you had the situation we often read in the press, but again it's often to do with people in the limelight? Do you get people who want to take custody of the dog and the cat? And
you'd be absolutely staggered. Quite often you can have a case involving maybe £2 or £3 million worth of assets. The husband and wife, or the separating couple as the case may be, they will agree what they're doing with regard to the millions of pounds of property, etc. The big issue is, for example, the dog or the photograph album. You'd be surprised what people are willing to spend significant amounts of money arguing about.
Yes,
so, yeah.
I'm sure you must have heard them all. Damien, it's been a pleasure. Time has just flown by, but can I thank you for coming on to Chat City, and maybe we can get you back in to talk a little more to us in the near future.
No problem at all. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So that was Damian Baron from Harrison Drury here in Preston, and you're listening to Chat City, Preston FM.
Thanks for listening to our podcasts. But don't forget, Chat City is live weekdays from 10 till noon on 103.2 Preston FM.